Welcome, folks. Good to see you all. I hope everyone is well, and I feel very grateful to be able to tune in with you in the middle of this week and resume this rhythm of looking at our Torah together, pausing from whatever else we're busy with. Please join me in an opening bracha, and let this opening bracha be like a sanctuary of words for us to help us create the space to study together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Parashat Noach. Shlomo, I was thinking that we might hopefully get to see you today. I don't know what's happening in Philadelphia, but it's a bit rainy here this morning, and I thought that was very appropriate for this week's parasha. It's a little wet here, which is nice. It's a nice kind of wet. It's the kind that the garden really loves, I think.
Kind of cloudy here.
A little cloudy there. Okay. Well, I hope you get just the right amount of rain if and when you need it. In honor of Parashat Noach, before we study, I want to just sing with you a little bit. I'm going to share in just a second the words for, it's one of the Zmirot for Shabbat. So I know it's Wednesday afternoon and it might be a weird time to sing Shabbat Zmirot, but this one has built into it the refrain, which references the dove in the Noah story. So let me just share it and just sing a little tiny bit of it before, and then we'll dig in to study. Share screen here. So the refrain that I'm referring to is here, Yona matza bo manoach, v'sham yanuchu yigyei koach. And I think the translator here, the wandering dove will find her nest, and we can all find our rest, since it's a Shabbat song. It's meant to help us settle into Shabbat. I think there's even a teaching that says Wednesday is the middle of the week and it's a good time to start preparing for Shabbat. So, okay, so join me if you know this. Yom Shabbaton in lishkoach, zichro kereach hanichoach, Yona matza bo manoach, v'sham yanuchu yigyei koach. And I'll just do that line again. Yona matza bo manoach, v'sham yanuchu yigyei koach. I'd like to look with you today at the story of the Tower of Babel, which is in the latter part of Parashat Noach. And so we're going to acknowledge the important epic story of the flood and then move on from there. As the Tower of Babel is just almost seems like a little non sequitur there. But I think we'll see at least one way that it's not at all a non sequitur, but very much part of the unfolding story of how God relates to humanity. God has to figure out how to deal with godly disappointment in the way that humanity seems to be evolving. And that is central to the Noah story, the flood story, but also central to the story of the Tower of Babel. So now, can I figure out how to get my, okay. So I'd like to begin with you by just looking at the text of the story of the Tower of Babel. I was searching for what could we call this week's study sheet, and I thought about this. which for anybody that doesn't know what I'm talking about here in my title, Use Your Words, is what we often say to young children who are just developing language and who may not even remember that they have the words in their vocabulary to express themselves, and they don't have to just throw a temper tantrum. So we would say to them, use your words. And that just seemed like a fitting place to go for a story that's all about language and the power of language and the danger of language. Okay, so here is the story of the Tower of Babel, Genesis chapter 11. Vayhi kol haaretz safa echad. All of the land had one language, udvarim achadim, and they all spoke the same words. And we can already pause here to note that in Hebrew, this word dvarim, which is being translated here perfectly fine to say that these are words, but we also know that a davar in Hebrew is an idea, a thing. And so we're going to see in the unfolding of the commentaries here that it's not just that they were speaking the same words, but that the words, the fact that they all spoke the same language, turned out to be forcing them into a kind of groupthink that at least God didn't think was a good idea. Okay, second verse. Well, actually, I'm going to skip quickly here. This is just talking about their location. They were migrating towards the east, going into the third verse now. Vayomru ish el re'ehu, each one said to the other, Hava nilbana levenim, let's make bricks. V'nisrefa lisrefa, we'll burn them until they're really hard like stone. Vatihi lahem halvena la'even, make them like as hard as stone. V'achamer haya lahem lachomer. So they made building material that was strong, like mortar. Vayomru hava nivne lanu ir umigdal. Let's, they said to themselves, Vayomru, they spoke to themselves and said, let's build a city and a tower. Verosho bashamayim, the top of the tower will be in heaven. And this is so interesting here. V'na'aseh lanu shem. We will, by doing this, by making this tower in the midst of this great city that we're going to build, we will make ourselves a name. Pen nafut al pnei kol haaretz. So that we won't be scattered, dispersed all over the earth. And I want to just, if I could put a pin right here, na'aseh lanu shem, this is going to be something interesting for us to notice as we go along. Okay, going on now, verse 5. Vayered Adonai lirot et ha'ir. God went down to look at the city that was being built, at Hamigdal and the tower, asher banu b'nei ha'adam, the ones that the children of humanity were building. Vayomer Adonai, hein am echad v'safa echad. Lechulam, excuse me. These people are a nation of one language, one unified way of speaking. V'zeh hachilam la'asot. And if this keeps going, this thing of them all thinking the same way and speaking the same way, there's going to be no end to what they will think they can accomplish. Va'ata lo yibatzer mehem kol ish yazmu la'asot. They'll start to think that nothing is out of their reach. So God says, the godly solution here is Hava nerda v'navla sham sifatam. Let's go down and confuse their speech, mix it up. And I couldn't find a definitive answer to my question about this word v'navla. Maybe one of you will know. But I believe it's from the same root as lebalbel, which is where we get the name Babel, Bavel, the Tower of Babel. Let's confuse or confound their speech. Asher lo yishma'u ish sfat re'ehu. So until they won't even understand each other. And there'll be such an inability to communicate. Vayafetz Adonai otam misham al pnei kol haaretz. And so God scattered them all over the land. Vayachdelu livnot ha'ir. And they ceased from building this city that they were building. Al kain kara shema Bavel. And so it was called Bavel, Babel. Kisham balal Adonai sfat kol haaretz, because of this thing that happened of God confounding all of the language of the people. And from there scattered them all over the earth. So I'm going to stop the share for a minute, and just so we can all look at each other again. I'm starting here. This is not a new story for me, and I don't think it's a new one for any of you either, I assume. But I was, again, so surprised at, so God can do whatever God wants. God can start a flood if God wants to. God has all kinds of tools at God's disposal. But in this story, language is seen as the dangerous thing, and the language is the response. God says, I'm going to go down and mix up their language. It just really struck me that that language is at the center of this, that when there could have been many other godly responses. Okay, we are going to have time for sharing thoughts together, but I want to keep going now. Go back to my sheet. Okay. Okay, so first of all, let's just pause and notice this connection with language, and that we just last week finished the story of creation. And what's the main tool for creation in our story of creation? It's language. Every single day of creation is brought about by a divine utterance, which is remarkable and worth our noticing. And then here, I've just added in, this is Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi's translation of our prayer, Baruch She'amar. And I apologize for the Hebrew formatting. I couldn't quite figure out how to line it up better, but this is Reb Zalman's translation of the familiar prayer that we say in our morning prayers, Baruch She'amar v'haya ha'olam. Blessed one, Reb Zalman says, you talked the worlds into being. Blessed one, your word makes for becoming. Baruch Omer ve'oseh. Blessed one, you decree and sustain. Baruch Gozer u'mekayem. So again, right at the opening of our own prayer practice, and we highlight the power of language, the importance of language, the power of godly language to create the world. Okay, now let's keep going. So this is now Ha'emek Davar. This is a 19th century commentator, and he's commenting on verses 1 and 2. This is just to roll back up here for a second, he's commenting on this. Safa echat udvarim achadim, the idea that there was one language, and that one language even was a mechanism for everyone to be thinking the same way. Okay, he says, Lo bi'er hakatuv hadvarim ele beromez k'mevoar b'midrashim. The text did not explain what those words were. Rather, it leaves a hint, remez k'mevoar b'midrashim, as is explained in some midrashim. He doesn't tell us which ones. Aval lo pirshan hakatuv ki'im shehayu dvarim achadim. The words themselves are not explained by the text. Ulelamdenu dila mishum hadvarim hitorer hakadosh baruch hu. It just tells us that they were the same words, to teach us that it wasn't because of the content of the words themselves that the Holy One of Blessing was distressed. Ki'im bishvil shehayu achadim. It was simply, they were what they were. And in its simplicity, they were not sin. And on the contrary, all appears well. But the problem was, he says at the end of this quote, here what happened is that they all thought the same thing. And this came to be the problem of the settlement. So again, it's not that they all spoke the same language, but that only having one language turned out to be an impediment to people having their own thoughts. Now we have a little bit from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. I never knew his middle name was Henry until I found this piece from him. He says, when God sought to halt the plan of the people of Babel to build a tower that would reach heaven, he merely confused their language so they were unable to communicate. Excuse me. Language remains basic to the existence of human groups. It was the rise of nationalism in the 19th century that led to the gradual downplaying of regional dialects in favor of a single shared language across the territory over which a political authority had sovereignty. He says to us, to this day, differences of language where they exist within a single nation are the source of ongoing political and social friction. For example, between English and French speakers in Canada, Dutch, French, and German and Walloon speakers in Belgium, the Spanish and the Basque. We could come up with lots of other examples. God created the natural universe with words. We create and sometimes destroy the social universe with words. He says, never take language lightly, implies the Torah, for it was through language that God created the natural world, and through language that we create and sustain our social world. It is as essential to our survival as the air we breathe. I want to just pause here and just look at this when he's mentioning the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, and the way that language played a role in that political and social movement. As I'm reading this, I can't help but think about, that was exactly when modern Hebrew started to blossom and become again a living language. We read about the early Hebrew writers in the early 19th, mid 19th century, which then, eventually bring us in the late 19th century, early 20th century, some of our greatest Hebrew writers as an expression of nationalism, as a connection to what would become Zionism. So the point here is Rabbi Sacks is making, and others are going to make for us, is the importance of language in defining us as a people. Okay, now we have a little bit from Shai Held, from his book, The Heart of Torah. He says, Genesis starts out describing what seems like a story of human unity, of people living together and successfully communicating with one another. Considering that the story is usually regarded as a tale of human failure so profound that God feels it necessary to put a stop to their labors, it seems a strange way to begin. Exactly as I was feeling. I thought, what's so bad about human unity? But he goes on to say, a great deal depends on how we understand unity. If everyone speaks, quote, the same language and utilizes, quote, the same words, then perhaps by implication they think the same thoughts and hold the same opinions. Perhaps then this story is really about, is really not, I think I mistyped that, is really not about unity, but about uniformity, which is different. And that's where the alarm bell starts to go off for God, according to this interpretation. It's not that we don't want people to be unified in their mission, but when we feel that there's no room for individuality, for our diversity, then we're in trouble. Before I go on, I wanted to scroll back up here for a minute. I paused up here in reading through this part from the Torah. So what's the rationale for building this tower in the first place? It's na'aseh lanu shem, to make ourselves a name, which is, it's so interesting. This is this little phrase here. Can I highlight it? No. Wait a minute, now I can. This one right here. V'na'aseh lanu shem. Let's make a name for ourselves. And this is interesting because, I think you're all familiar with this practice of studying text. One of the tools is to look at what comes before and what comes after. If you look at the story of Babel, the Tower of Babel in the Torah, you see that right before it and right after it are two long genealogies with many, many names, which sound, frankly, arcane to us nowadays. And this story in the middle, right between those two long genealogies, it seems that everyone's anonymous. No one is named. No one has a name. They are all just these anonymous people building this huge tower, and they all speak the same. And according to these commentaries that we're reading, they all think the same way. And it's as if the Torah is saying names are extremely important because they help confer individuality and identity. And without that, we become just, we become separated from our own divine spark and our own ability to, I don't know, to answer that question that we were trying to answer last week of Ayeka, where are you? Where are you? Not where are all of you as a people. Okay, let me go back once again to our source sheet. So scrolling down here, shy. Okay. I just wanted to share, this is just a piece from an academic article about language and identity. Major human rights instruments and leading scholars identify two key social values of language. For individuals, language is constitutive of cultural identity. We are what we speak. And how many times have you, I'm just going to stop this so I can see everybody again. How many times have you had the experience of either speaking a different language and noticing how that impacts your thinking in a different way, or being in a place where another language is spoken and you feel it's so hard to not only sort of cognitively understand what's going on, but just to feel a part of the culture there. So this idea that language helps form who we are. We are what we speak. And for society, linguistic pluralism increases diversity. Linguistic pluralism increases diversity. This is very academic language, but it sounds like it's coming right out of this story from the Torah. We know now, we think of, the scientific paradigms that we adhere to now, and we know that new diversity, biological diversity is key to surviving as a species. And so we can apply the same thinking to language. Since language, I'm going back to this reading now, since language is central to identity, one's freedom to use one's language is seen as inherent in the dignity of the human person, and thus falls within the ambit of human rights law. This article goes into a long thing about human rights, which we're not going to do from here today, but just the piece about language. Because minority groups are more vulnerable in society, they are at a greater risk of losing their languages and thereby also their distinct identity. Should this happen, injury would be borne both by the minority and by the entire society. For heterogeneity in languages has a positive value. It reflects and enhances cultural diversity, which in turn enriches the world. Having decided both that diversity is a positive good and that international human rights law has a role in promoting it, she goes on to talk about treaties and scholars that want to enforce the right of linguistic minorities to maintain a high level of linguistic separatism. Okay, and then just a little bit more from this scholar. There is, however, another and perhaps more obvious perspective on the function of language, which would be called communicative. In this view, language is above all an instrumental tool for communication, and linguistic homogeneity facilitates market cooperation and political unification. Here, a value is assigned to the smooth operation of the market and the political state, and linguistic diversity is seen as generally imposing costs rather than benefits to society. And she ends this introduction by saying, this is the natural reading of the Tower of Babel, when God says, come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. God does so in order to impose the cost of confusion, not to bestow the gift of diversity. I can't help, as I was reading this, I couldn't help but think about the experience we've been through in the United States in the last, I don't know, now it's going on 5 years, about the way language has been used in the political arena to enforce a kind of groupthink, a very dangerous kind of groupthink. We've seen it play out we're seeing it play out still now in our national rhetoric around a response to the pandemic even. But I felt like this use of language for political means was, I'll just say, nefariously on display. Okay, one last, actually, I want to save this last commentary for after. So let's pause here and make some space for your thoughts and your input. And I see that there are right. So Barb, you're saying in verse 7, let us go down, and you're asking, who's the us? And that's a great question. I will attempt to answer that, but there may be others here who have a thought. When I read that, when it says, God says, let us go down, like who is God talking to? I just think of the earlier interactions in the story of creation that God has with what are described as angels. We think of the creation of human beings, and God seems to be talking to some court of divine beings in trying to figure out how to move forward with creation. God says, let's make these humans betsalmenu, in our image, as if like God is having a whole discussion with the, God's cabinet or something, divine cabinet. So I assume when I read it here that it's sort of the same. Like God is calling together as a court of angels and saying, look, we just finished with the flood, but here's another problem. These human beings keep doing things on their own, and it doesn't seem to comport with what the godly mind was imagining. I don't know if anybody else has a thought about who is the us, and just responding to Barb. Steve, I see that you're going to jump in here in a second.
Well, I could react to that if you want to
Great.
say, because whenever I think of the us, I always think of the and this is my predisposition of thinking that we are not alone in the universe, and that if the godliness, the vision of a God actually transpired in history from the visitation of other intelligent beings in the universe, that the us might be a bunch of them, the beings, so to speak, and that, you can spin the science fiction of that in whichever way you want, but you can imagine the Vulcans coming to this planet and saying, well, we got to help these Neanderthal types to figure things out. So we're going to mess with their minds. And it's more than one being. It's multiple gods that are multiple aliens. But that's not why I raised my hand, but you asked for it.
Yeah, I want to hang on one second. Well, at some point I want to come back to what you just said about science fiction, because I have something else to share about that. But go ahead.
So my initial, my head is spinning with reactions. This is just so prime for discussion. So I'll only try to say one thing, which is that I always think about, well, who was writing this and why were they writing this? Why was this story of Babel? And, which I take as more the myth, even in the minds of those who wrote it down, as opposed to being potentially a true historic event.
Sure.
And what was the message? What was going on in their lives that had them react to this idea of there's this hubris of these people who are going to build this tower and show how, important they are, just like a few other people we know in the world who put their names all over things. And so who were those, what was happening to our ancient scribes and recorders who wrote down, who came up with this myth?
Mhm.
What were they reacting to? And so
Mhm.
I'm curious as to whether some of the scholars that you've studied have an opinion about that.
I'm sure that that's a question that has been asked. I'm thinking of Mim Eisenstein, who's also asks that question a lot. It's an important one to ask. For sure, um, this section of the Torah, the flood section, is the flood epic, is what I'm referring to, was written in response to other flood epics that we know about in other ancient cultures. Um, the addition of this piece about about the tower and the use of language, I don't know enough to know. I'd have to research myself to see what are they responding to.
Mhm.
Um, Shlomo, do you want to respond just to that? And then I'll go to Harriet and Clem and then Marcia.
But no, I wasn't going to respond to that specifically. I was going to talk about, I mean, you said God could do whatever he wanted earlier today,
Okay, well,
but
hang on just a second, because I want to catch these other folks who have been waiting. So Harriet, I'm just going in the order of how I see people jumping in. Harriet or Clem, just don't forget to unmute.
So what I kept thinking about, and it's almost the reverse of the question, who's the us, is who's the God?
Mhm.
And I kept going back to the writers and what might the writers at that time been wanting to convey.
Mhm.
And it was curious to me, and then I'll stop talking, that there were so many fears of people worshiping other gods,
Mhm.
and they wanted to unify them. And here we have a situation where they're saying, no, unity isn't so good, or uniformity isn't so good.
Uniformity.
Right.
Mhm.
So I'm just curious about your response to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really I think it's what you're the thread you're pulling on in your thoughts, Harriet, is it's one
Excellent.
of the places where our tradition seems to be a little bit radical, because it says, actually, we don't want you to all think the same thing. We actually think that's dangerous. That leads to a kind of a totalitarian state, and we're not interested in seeing that as a manifestation of our relationship with God. That's not what this is about. It is interesting to me to wonder. I mean, I'm always curious if sorry, I'm going around in circles here. Uh, if you accept the premise that the Torah is the story of the search for God, or the search for a relationship with God, part of that story has to also include the evolution of God. And this is an important little window here in God's evolution, because we had the creation, God creates everything, and then God destroys everything, right? That's how the story of Noah, the parasha, begins, the destruction of everything. And that concludes with a promise from God that, that kind of destruction is never going to happen again. God understands that you can't just, ball up your bad draft that you don't like and throw it away. So there's a kind of a humbling or a maturation somehow, I imagine, of this godly presence. And now here in the Tower of Babel story, God sees something is not right, but doesn't choose to bring another flood, doesn't choose to wipe out all of creation, chooses instead to say, let me use a tool that's a human tool. Language is a human tool. And so I'm going to use that to try to rectify what I see going on the planet. I'm not sure if I just answered the question you're asking.
I'm not sure either, but I'll think about it.
Okay, those are the thoughts that came up for me. And please, if others want to respond as well. Marcia.
So what I noticed in the opening lines was how so many of the words, I think, are a foreshadowing of the Egypt experience,
Mm-hmm.
because we have let us make the bricks and burn them,
Uh-huh.
which, is certainly language used by the Egyptians, to burden the Jews. And the fear of the Egyptians was, or they wanted to scatter the people, right? So that they wouldn't become powerful, the Hebrews.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was looking at this, I was thinking, well, here we go down the road of enslavement. And it was just interesting to see the same language being used here.
Mhm.
So, and then when we were talking about, the richness of diversity in language, I understand that, but I was having the opposite response, which was sometimes when I listen or I'm in the presence of others speaking foreign languages, I'm wondering what it is they're actually saying and what are the differences between us or not. And when I've learned a language and been able to connect, I'm always taken by the similarities that are in the language and the human emotions that are reflected, even though the languages are different.
Yes.
We are all coming from that same human place.
Mhm.
So that's just my 2 cents.
Mhm. For sure, there's that underlying connection of humanity. Thank you. Okay, Shlomo, do you want to jump in here, or you just don't forget
Well,
to.
I was going to say, I was going to talk about the evolution of God as you did.
Well, go ahead.
Well, the only thing I was going to say about it is that, in a sense, I don't know if I actually want to use language here, but it's immediately after Noah's sacrifice to God, following the flood,
Mm-hmm.
when God smells the reach nichoach
Mm-hmm.
of Noah's sacrifice, which I think has much more to do with Noah than the smell of roasting meat,
Mm-hmm.
as I think I said last year. That this God then is restrained from destroying the rest of the world, from the world
You're saying
again.
because of the sacrifice?
Yeah, because it's immediately after the sacrifice that God says, using language, I won't do that again,
Mm-hmm.
even though the inclination of man and his children is bad. He does say Yetzer Hara, but
Mm-hmm.
even after Noah's sacrifice, that change in God takes place. I think that's when he says, I'll never again destroy the whole place.
Mm-hmm.
But anyhow, that's what I was going to say at that point.
Mm-hmm. I can't help but think that the image of Noah making a sacrifice and those words, I forgot about that. Reach nichoach.
Well,
For what? Go ahead.
I have a lot to say about that.
Right. But just for people that may not be familiar with that language, that's language that we hear a lot in the book of Leviticus, which is a codification of the priestly rituals and rites that would have perhaps gone on. Well, we think went on in the days of the temple, and the Torah wants us to think also went on during the years of wandering. That's a different problem.
But it
But
doesn't mean a
the
sweet smell
idea
of
that,
meat.
what does it mean?
When Cain and Abel offer their sacrifices, Abel offers this incredible sacrifice of prime grade A, the best of his flocks. There's no reach nichoach.
Mm-hmm.
The words reach nichoach do not appear after that first really meaty sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
They only appear after the sacrifice of Noah, which is puny compared to Abel's sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the words reach nichoach come in. And it's been translated as a sweet smell of roasting meat, which has this impact on God, whatever. Doesn't mean the sweet smell of roasting meat, as far as I'm concerned. It's reach nichoach, a Noahide, a smell of a Noahide quality. I think the word nichoach is directly related to Noah, and the qualities are tzaddik v'tamim, righteous and humble.
And humble or pure. Mm-hmm.
And the reason it's then mentioned so many times after our sacrifices is because God is saying it's not the ritual itself which is important, it's the qualities of the offerer of the sacrifice, which moves God to be compassionate. Anyhow, I didn't want to get into all of that, but.
Well, no, I think you're actually reminding me of something that I meant to bring up today, which is the contrast between, and then Bob Singer, we're coming to you. The contrast between this story of the Tower of Babel, which is all about language and language put to use in a way that is not helpful, not acceptable, and then a godly response, which is also about language. Noah has nothing to say. Noah has no dialogue. He's just silent Noah. I mean, after the flood, he has some things to say to his children, and that's a different study session. But in this moment of offering up a sacrifice, that's his way of speaking to God. Never once does he say, God, are you sure about this ark thing? Or I don't know, is this really a good idea? Nobody will listen to me. You know, the way Moses does and constantly saying, I'm not really the guy for this job. No, it doesn't say anything. He's silent. He has no language. And it's only at the end of the experience of the Mabul, the flood. I just paused because I thought, is Mabul connected to Babel? I don't know. I'd have to look that up. That direct relationship with God comes forward, and in the form of this sacrifice, and now later in the Tower of Babel, in the form of more language, the way we understand language. Thank you, Shlomo, for bringing that up. Okay, Bob, and then Amy.
So you brought up thoughts for me about people speaking the same language and then there being a change. It strikes me that even those of us who are speaking the same language now, none of us are speaking exactly the same language. Mm-hmm. When I say something, it means something to me. That doesn't mean it means the same thing to someone else. Mm-hmm. I think about when I was training young doctors and medical residents. They would learn how to take a few symptoms, put it together to a diagnosis, and then tell people what the diagnosis was and read the 2 or 3 sentences about what people were supposed to do. And they were astonished to learn that wasn't all of medical practice, because you'd say the same words to different people and it will be heard differently. Mm-hmm. And communication is not what you say, it's what other people hear. Mm-hmm. And you need to know who you're talking to, and you need to sort of figure out what they are hearing in order to know whether you're communicating correctly. Mm-hmm. And, the insight that we're all speaking different languages is true for every one of us. Even if we're speaking English, none of us knows what's going on inside other people's heads. Yes. We have to be able to check out in a conversation what's going on in order to know if a communication is succeeding.
Absolutely. How many times, I don't know about you all, but how many times have I been in a conversation with someone, let's say a planning meeting, and we discuss a thing or two, whatever, and we walk away and we realize that person walked away thinking we're doing one thing, and I walked away thinking we're doing something else. Even from people that have, been in close communication. So yes, for sure. Let's go on. Amy, you have your hand up.
So my point actually ties into what Bob was saying. When you call something a Tower of Babel, to me, that's saying blah, 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 blah. Babel is meaningless. It's sound and it's noise. Mm-hmm. So what I think about is when everybody is talking, do they hear each other? Mm-hmm. Which is what Bob was talking about. Like if you're talking all the time, you don't really hear what someone else is saying. And also I know people who are just waiting. They're not listening. They're just waiting for their turn to talk. Mm-hmm. So my points about this are, first of all, is this about having people hear and listen to each other, and also their ability to hear God. Because if you're talking all the time and filling up all the airwaves, mm-hmm. and you can't listen to God, you can't listen to yourself, you can't listen to anybody else. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that gives a whole different spin on Shema Yisrael. Listen, Israel. Listen. Stop talking and listen. Yeah, thank you. Boy, that's going to really help me with my prayers next time. Thank you, Amy. Okay, Audrey, you were going to say something.
I have just a quick question, because you referenced this, that before and after this particular piece is this long list of very orderly list, yes, of the descendants. Mm-hmm. And then here, the last sentence in this chapter, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. And then verse 10, which is part of the chapter 11, begins with this explanation of all of these different people ending up with Abram, Abraham's father. And I have this little sticky note in my my JPS book that has that list from Shem to Abram. And I'm just wondering if you could share with us a little bit about this particular section. It's stuck right here, which kind of after this chaos of the language, it then starts again with this very organized lineage.
Yes.
Can you speak to that at all?
You mean why does it go back to that?
Yeah, like why it looks like this piece of the Tower of Babel could be anywhere else. It seems to interrupt the narrative. And sometimes you've talked about, the wide lens, and then you focus in the lens.
Yeah.
And it seems like, this is a wider lens taken, then we're immediately brought back into this family line.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious about the placement of all that.
I mean, I'm not sure I have a satisfying answer for what you're asking, just sitting here right now. I'm just going to the insight that I got from reading. This came from Shai Held's book, and he's in turn quoting a scholar at Pardes in Jerusalem. Her name is Judy Klitzner, and she's the one that noted the juxtaposition of the very specific named individuals, one generation to the next, next to this anonymous group of, there's a phrase I'm looking for in English and I can't quite find it right now. It's an anonymous group that are not really thinking. They're just all speaking the same thing, and they're searching for a name. As I was pointing out before, it says, "V'na'aseh lanu shem." Let's make ourselves a name because we don't have one. The people that came before us have one, and now what's coming after will bring us all the way to Abram, who, of course, even Abram, just his own name is so important. He starts out with one name and he acquires an extra hey to make himself more of a name when he feels that, his relationship with God has been more fully realized. He becomes Avraham. There's so much attention paid to his name and exactly how to say his name and exactly how to spell it. And that is in contrast with this group of, okay, I'll say it. I was thinking of this basket of deplorables. But don't quote me on that. I don't even want to get involved in that. But something like the unwashed masses who are just all not thinking and just speaking the same.
Yeah, okay, that's a good explanation. Thank you. Yeah, that works.
That's something. Go ahead, Shlomo.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it's a literary technique that the authors use simply to put in a list of begats between different episodes to kind of separate between them or give them each their own place. But I don't know, we'd have to look at where do these lists of begats occur and see if there is really something specific about why they're there, or if it's simply the author saying, okay, this happened, here's a list of begats, now we're on to something else.
Yeah, that's a perfectly excellent way to go. I'm also noticing, Courtney, you're saying here is you're responding to Audrey's question, I think. Is it related to the number of names, which I'm sure someone has done an analysis of that. It's not me, but someone has said, let's see exactly how many names are we talking about here and how many generations. The destruction, you're saying, Courtney, the destruction of the tower and the city alters the lineage in a pointedly numerical way. Could be.
I think so, or I wonder anyway. I've never looked into that in particular, but as I'm listening to people talk about why these names, why not other names, I wonder if it's not so much the names, but maybe the number of names.
Yeah, it could easily. I'm sure that somebody somewhere has made a study of that, and we could, if we look, we could probably find it. Thank you. Harriet or Clem, and then Mark, and then I want to show you a closing.
I think we both have something to say. That's okay.
Okay.
Let me inject this just very briefly. We know that the creation story and the flood story and the Nephilim have their genesis in other cultures, and that overlaps. Is there anything similar that in other cultures at that time that relate to the Tower of Babel? You don't know.
I would bet the answer is yes.
Yes.
If we looked at Mesopotamian or Akkadian other ancient cultures to see, do they have some similar tale like this? I mean, your question, Clem, also, puts me back in mind of the question I often have, which no one will ever be able to answer, but when was this composed? If we accept the premise that the Torah, and I guess we would say the Tanakh, the whole Hebrew Bible, was finally only canonized in the 1st century CE, we know that those stories, many of the stories, were important to the ancient Hebrews for many generations before that.
In an oral tradition.
Yeah, orally, or even written, but there's one, Nehemiah Poland says that before the Tanakh was fully canonized, these scrolls were sort of individual scrolls. Like they might have been carried around together in a pouch, but they weren't all together in one, one canonization, which to me brings up the question of, well, when was this composed? And as I think, Harriet, you were asking before, or somebody was, what were they composed in response to?
Yeah.
And the Babel story does seem like this interesting non sequitur that's just plugged in right there in the middle. Was it composed at a different time in response to something else? Persian, maybe? I don't know.
Let me yield to my wife.
Always wise.
Well, Audrey's question made me think, and you just referred to it too, about the placement of this story and why. And I wondered if it is in fact because the writers didn't want to imply that in listing all of the genealogies, that those people thought alike or should not think alike. And almost as just a place marker, a bookmarker of weight.
We don't support groupthink here.
Right.
And I think you are onto something here, Harriet. I like the way you just did that. Because what do we know about Abraham, who is the ultimate, landing place of this part of the Torah? He was the one who challenged the current paradigm. He was the one who said, I'm going down a different direction here. And I don't know what it's going to look like, but I'm going here instead. I'm not willing to just follow what everyone else is doing just because they're all doing it. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Mark Wolf, did you still want to say something? You had your hand up before, I think.
Yeah, I just want to say about communication and I think what's still universal and crosses all cultures is music. We really can understand the music of others in a very strong and emotional way, and it speaks to the commonality of that we have, regardless of the cultures and that we're in.
Hear, hear. Music speaks louder than words. Yeah. If I'll just say this, if you haven't yet seen the movie Coda, CODA, go find it and see it. It's pretty wonderful, and it very much speaks to what Mark is mentioning here. Okay, I have one more commentary I wanted to share by way of closing. I think okay, let me go back here. Okay, let me scroll all the way down here. This is from a long midrash. Don't worry, we're not reading this whole thing. From Sefer HaYashar. And this midrash imagines the actual building of the tower. Excuse me. It says here, it took a long time to build this tower. They had already built the city, and the tower within it had reached an enormous height. By reason of the very great height, it took a full year to carry the stones and the bricks to reach the builders. And it was done all the time, going up and coming down. You can't help but think of Jacob's ladder in that moment, but I don't think that's what they mean. And then I bolded here the part I wanted us to see. Vayehiu ela olim ve'ela yordim. So difficult was the ascension and the descending. Kol hayom. Vayehiu ka'asher tipol levana mi'adam. When a brick would happen to fall down and break, v'tishaber vayivku chulam aleha. All of them would lament and weep, like, oh no, we can't have a brick, we can't lose a brick. But the Midrash goes on to say, asher yipol adam vayamot ein mabit elu mehem. But when a person, a human being, would fall down and die, nobody would notice. And this was part of why God said, something bad is going on here. If the people are so attached to this thing that they're building that they don't even notice each other, and they don't even notice when one another has either suffered or, God forbid, has actually died, then something is very wrong. And it says here at the end of this bolded part, Vayada Adonai et machshavotam. And God knew all of their wicked thoughts because of this vignette, because of seeing they're so attached, they're really way overly attached to the project that they've lost sight of one another. And that can never be good. This Midrash goes in all kinds of interesting places. Another time, maybe we'll have time to read through and see the wild imagination of some of these early rabbis. But I just wanted to come to this ending point, which I think is rather encouraging. I'll just read it in the Hebrew here. V'hanisharim bahem ka'asher yadu v'hevinu et hara'a asher ba'a alehem. They soon came to know and understand the evil which had come over them. Asher ba'a alehem. V'ya'azvu et habinyan. So they said, okay, we're not going to work on this project anymore. They abandoned the building. Vayifotzu, I think that is, gam hem al pnei kol haaretz. And they dispersed themselves over all the face of the earth. They not only shut down the project, they said, you know what, we really should all go in our different directions. I think this is Vayichadlu livnot et ha'ir ve'et hamigdal. So it came to pass that the children of humanity stopped building the city and the tower. And then it just ends by reaffirming what the Torah says, Al kain kara lemakom hahu Bavel kishem balal Hashem Adonai sfat kol haaretz, because the Lord confounded the language of all the earth, and that's why it's called Bavel. But the important thing to me here was they realized themselves, the people realized themselves that this project was doomed, and they took it upon themselves. They took responsibility for themselves and said, we should shut this down, and we should take responsibility for arranging ourselves in a better way, giving room for us to differentiate into all the many different languages and cultures that are possible in human expression. It's just a midrash. Shlomo, I saw you shaking your head and rolling your eyes at that. And I know that's sometimes our reaction to midrash, but I feel like it's a way to hold on to hope, and a way to hold on to the possibility that humanity, that we have within us the ability to tune in to our godly potential, even before God has to come down here and mix things up and, keep us from building the towers that we really shouldn't be building. So we come right to 1 o'clock. Steve, I'm happy to hang around and chat with you another minute if you want, but I want to just honor the other timing. And before we say goodbye for today, I want to just mention, as we go through these weeks into the year of Torah, it's an invitation if anybody would like to sponsor a Torah study in honor of someone or in memory of someone. If you just tell me who that would be, I would be delighted. And I would also invite you to make a contribution to the synagogue in memory or in honor of whoever it is that you're trying to remember or honor. So think about that going forward. It would be lovely to have, to offer up our study in honor of somebody or in memory of somebody every week going forward. Okay, everyone, I think that's it for today. Shavua Tov, everybody keep well, and thank you, Audrey, for hosting us. Steve, do you want to? Don't
I
forget to
simply
unmute.
was going to react to your statement. I love that you ended with what you ended with. You said they realized that the project was doomed, and what I thought you were going to say, what comes to me, is they realized that what was pushing them forward, why they chose this project, that those inclinations were evil or were wrong. In other words, it was the hubris, it was the lack of humility, it was the wanting to pound their chest and say, look what we've done, that they realized that that was wrong. Not necessarily that they couldn't build the tower, but just that the reason they were building it wasn't something that
Wrong reason.
that reflected well on them, and and in fact reflected very poorly on them, and they should go in a different, they should abandon it. Not only that, abandon whatever community they had that brought them to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Hannah, just don't forget to unmute.
Yeah, I actually was thinking that we didn't put emphasis on the Lebanim and the Chemar, but this was a great discovery. This was something that they suddenly discovered, that they can make things, you know, more stable, tower and so on. And they basically thought, oh, and it just reminded me a little bit, even the internet. Once we had the internet, we are feeling also that we are godly. So there is a punishment that when you discover something boomy, you think, wow, I can conquer the world, and it's
Sky's
so
the limit here.
focused that's for me is the lesson. You can never be God, or you can never say just because you made such a discovery.
I think it's a great thought. They got so excited about their new technology that they lost sight of each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kol hakavod. Everybody, thank you so much. Oh, Marcia, just to wrap up, you don't forget to unmute if you're speaking. Wait, hold on. We're not hearing you. Oh, there.
It's interesting to me how they want to make a name for themselves. And then when we finish this story, the next line is Eila Toldot Shem.
Yes.
These are the generations of Shem. And this is where we get the individualization and
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kol hakavod. Great. Wonderful. Okay, folks, I'm going to say goodbye for today.
Okay.
Everybody be well.
Thank
See
you.
you again soon.
Very uplifting, Rachel. Thank you.